it's a pleasure to be with you. In his foreword to our report on scientific reticence, which was just mentioned, what lies beneath, Professor Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber wrote, and I quote, "When the issue is the very survival of our civilization, conventional means of analysis may be useless." I'll just repeat that, conventional means of analysis may be useless, unquote. So it's from this perspective that I'll make some comments on climate risk markets and the state. And I guess my essential point is that when risks are existential, markets fail because they cannot adequately deal with such risks. They cannot mitigate the threat to society as a whole. This is true for weapons of mass destruction, it's true for pandemics, and it's true for ecological collapse, where the primary risk management responsibility lies with the state. It's also true for climate disruption, where markets have failed to heed the high-end risks, especially non-linear impacts and tipping points, which are difficult, if not impossible, to model when the costs may be infinite. When damages are beyond calculation, that is when the damages are infinite, which is what we were facing, then cost-benefit analysis, conventional risk analysis, and learning from failure are approaches which do not work. Let me give some examples. The current Paris Agreement commitments, if achieved, would likely result in a warming of 3 to 5 degrees by 2100. 3 degrees of warming is described in the literature as catastrophic, and 4 degrees is likely to be incompatible with the maintenance of human civilization. And yet, despite this evidence, the market response has been to grow emissions year on year. 3 to 5 degrees is clearly an existential threat to human civilization. That is a permanent and drastic curtailing of modern society's future development and perhaps even its existence. This prospect of existential risk requires a fundamentally different approach to risk management than the one that is currently being taken, including by policymakers internationally. It means, in the first instance, emphasising the lower probability, high impact, or what are called the fat tail risks, which may be devastating for human society. Secondly, applying the precautionary principle when faced with uncertain threats that may cause systematic ruin. Third, taking a normative approach to setting targets and strategy. And fourth, integrating responses across national and regional boundaries. In my analysis, neither the IPCC processes nor those of the UNFCCC make this approach. They focus on the middle of the road risks rather than the high-end possibilities. This is a fatal mistake. Let me give you one example. Climate policymakers regularly accept as reasonable a 33 to 50% risk of failure. We hear it all the time, a carbon budget, 50 to 67% chance of success. When that failure represents a planetary level systems disruption, I think this is ethically indefensible. I mean, none of us here would accept a 1% risk of failure if we were to fly in a commercial aeroplane, yet policymakers regularly accept risks of 1/3 to 1/2. The IPCC assessments bear a large responsibility for underplaying the risk with their preference for conservative projections and scholarly reticence. Let me now turn from risk to the physical realities. Schellenhuber reminds us, and I quote, "Political reality must be grounded in physical reality or it's completely useless." So let me just start with 4 understandings of the physical reality. The first is that warming has already reached 1.2 degrees and is accelerating, with 1.5 likely within a decade, certainly by 2030. The illusion of a carbon budget for keeping warming below 1.5 degrees or an incremental path for holding below 2 degrees are now fully exposed. Number 2, at just the current warming of 1.2 degrees, climate disruption is already dangerous. We have already passed tipping points for large-scale systems, including coral reefs, the Arctic sea ice, and the West Antarctic glaciers. There is debate at the moment about whether the Amazon rainforest is also close to its tipping point, and strong evidence that around 1.5 degrees the Greenland ice sheet will already reach its tipping point. To reiterate, at 1.2 degrees, climate change is already dangerous. Number 3, around 2030, when warming will be approaching or hitting 1.5 degrees, there will likely be blue water Arctic summers as the sea ice extent collapses. This risk will grow substantially, that Arctic carbon stores, including permafrost and boreal forests, will suffer substantial, accelerating and unstoppable losses a decade from now. And number 4, in the physical reality, in 2018, scientists, including some of your colleagues in Germany, proposed a hothouse Earth scenario, the most downloaded paper in the history of climate research. Their scenario was one in which system feedbacks and their interaction drive Earth's climate to what they called a point of no return, whereby further warming would become self-sustaining, that is, without further human emissions. This threshold, they said, could exist at a temperature rise as low as 2 degrees, even a little lower. In the follow-up paper in 2019, they said, and I will quote because I think this really summarises the physical position, the evidence from tipping points alone suggests we are in a state of planetary emergency. This is the authors of the paper. Both the risk and urgency of the situation are acute. They go on. If damaging tipping cascades can occur and a global tipping point cannot be ruled out, then this is an existential threat to civilization. No amount of economic cost-benefit analysis is going to help us. We might have already lost control of whether tipping happens, unquote. So that, I think, is unfortunately the physical reality. Actions. From this scientific analysis, I think there are four conclusions. The first is that even if the carbon budgets of the IPCC, which are far too generous, are accepted as on face value, national carbon budgets for developed economies like ours, the highest in the world with the United States, with high per capita emissions, those carbon budgets require annual decarbonisation rates of around 10% or more annually, once global equity issues are accounted for. For Australia, that is zero emissions by 2030 or before. In the developed economies, advocacy of the currently fashionable net zero by 2050 is simply climate colonialism, implicitly claiming a right by the rich for higher ongoing per capita emissions than people in the developing world. A 2050 timeframe will not prevent catastrophic outcomes, and such long-term targets have become an excuse for procrastination. Second action. The former UK Chief Scientist, Professor Sir David King, who has established the Cambridge Centre for Climate Repair, says we have reached a point where we can no longer simply say if we reduce emissions, we will be fine. Mitigation is vital, but, and this is a crucial and not well understood recent research finding, mitigation is vital, but it will not have a noticeable beneficial effect on the temperature trajectory for 2 decades due to the concurrent aerosol loss. That is, for the next 2 decades, reducing emissions will not slow the rate of warming. King, like James Hansen and many others, emphasises the need to get the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases down from the present level of 415 parts per million to well under 350 and ideally under 325 parts per million, with a large-scale carbon drawdown program to restore a safe climate. The Cambridge Centre says that this drawdown will need to begin within the next 5 years and reach 30 to 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent annually, which is an amount similar to current greenhouse emissions. I mean, it is an understatement to say this is a massive and challenging, almost unbelievable task. Thirdly, planetary cooling must now be on the agenda. Scientists fear, privately in conversations with me and others, that the Arctic dynamics, even this decade, may create the conditions for a hothouse Earth scenario. By 2030, conditions in the Arctic will have an unacceptable risk of triggering self-sustaining feedbacks and potentially humanity's descent into existential crisis. Regional cooling of the Arctic is now crucial to mitigating the hothouse Earth risk. Sir David King says, and I quote, "We need to determine how to restore damaged climate systems and the most effective strategy for refreezing the poles and the Himalayas. This too must begin as soon as possible," unquote. To summarise, zero emissions, even in a decade, coupled with large-scale drawdown, is not sufficient to negate the existential risk. There is no evidence yet that proposals such as solar radiation management, for example, have a net environmental or social effect. But if that proves to be the case, it may be considered a necessary measure. Fourthly, adaptation, that is managing the unavoidable risks and impacts, should be seen as a parallel strategy to mitigation and should prioritise actions to protect the most vulnerable human populations and nature. But adaptation is no substitute for the deep mitigation and restoration necessary. And there is a danger, we are seeing it in Australia here, of the adaptation trap, where most effort is put into adaptation and the lack of mitigation delivers a hothouse Earth scenario. Number 4, mobilisation. So next section, mobilisation. These tasks of reaching zero emissions as fast as possible, combined with large-scale carbon drawdown from the atmosphere, are enormous undertakings given the compressed timescale available. They both involve the disruptive stranding of fossil fuel assets and the remaking of much of our productive capacity and infrastructure. It would be the greatest planned peacetime transformation of the economy in history. The generalised collapse of contemporary societies is not certain or inevitable, but it is likely unless dramatic action makes climate the #1 priority of economics and politics. I repeat, the #1 priority of economics and politics, with an audacious planned transformation. In other words, what we have called a climate emergency response. As Benno noted in a 2008 book with Philip Sutton, we described a normal political paralysis mode in which there is a lack of urgency, market needs dominate political responses, budgetary allocations are restrained, and socio-economic goals are determined by political trade-offs, compromise and systemic inertia. And I think that describes policy making today. By contrast, we described an emergency response as one in which an immediate or looming threat to life, health, property or the environment is recognised, the threat is recognised. The speed of response is crucial, with the risk of the threat becoming overwhelming, what we have just seen with COVID. The crisis is of the highest priority for the duration, and bipartisanship and effective leadership are generally the norm. And finally, all available resources are devoted to the emergency. Societies that are successfully overcoming the COVID pandemic threat, I am very fortunate to live in one in my own country, are doing so with an explicitly emergency response that makes the threat, COVID, the highest priority of politics and economics based upon acceptance of the best available science. A whole lot of contemporary political beliefs have been overturned in order to face COVID. In an emergency like COVID, the leading role in mobilising society is taken by the state. The more successful COVID emergency responses have included the early exercise of hard state power to curtail non-essential production and movement as necessary. In my country, whether it's bushfires or floods which regularly threaten people and property, we do not put out attention to the market. The state responds to natural emergencies immediately because it is best positioned to prepare, to plan and to act. This is also necessary for the climate emergency because markets can neither adequately assess the risks nor mitigate the threat. due to the issues including infinite damages and non-linearities in the system. A recent IMF working paper notes, and I quote, "A growing agreement between economists and scientists that the risk of catastrophic and irreversible disaster is rising, implying potentially infinite costs of unmitigated climate change, including in the extreme human extinction," unquote. So that's an IMF paper. Let me say again, when damages are beyond calculation, cost-benefit analysis and conventional risk analysis break down. Climate is not a market optimization problem. It is a risk problem, the risk of the loss of capitalism, according to the US financial analyst Spencer Glendon. To repeat, it is not a risk problem, it is the risk of the loss of capitalism. Glendon also notes, and I quote, "The economics of climate change will be seen as one of the worst mistakes humans have ever made," unquote, overlooking consequences including mass migration and state breakdown, which are beyond models and market calculations. The climate problem won't be solved by capital markets. Markets require system stability, but we are now in an era of system-level instability in the finance sector, in the physical world, and in politics. We now face large-scale climate disruption, either by way of a planned fast emergency transition or, much worse, unplanned chaos, because non-linear physical change and socioeconomic system failure will inevitably occur as warming intensifies. In summary, gradualist solutions that assume that time is on our side are not relevant. The problem is exacerbated by the failure so far to decouple resource use from consumption, as well as carbon pollution from production. Business has consistently blocked the required state-level intervention and leadership. Inflamed by the fuel of financialisation, which triggered the 2008 global financial crisis, the lack of action on planetary limits, including climate, will destabilise financial markets, economic systems, and global security. At this point, the state, which is capable of delivering fast, disruptive change, will be forced to respond to systemic exceedance of planetary limits and market failure, take emergency action, redirect current economic behaviour to socially useful ends, and scale back production. And governments do have that power. We have seen it in the last year. Yanis Varoufakis says, one lesson from the 2020 pandemic response is, and I quote Yanis, "Governments have been choosing not to exercise their enormous powers so that those whom globalisation have enriched could exercise their own," unquote. And I think that's very true. Lastly, the challenges. In the current low growth period, decarbonisation and decoupling costs cannot be absorbed by growth, but only by reallocation. Add in equity issues within and between nations, and the lack of a credible scenario to provide 9 billion people with reasonable living standards means there is no choice but to reduce the excessive consumption of the richest 20% or more of the global population. Just as proposals focused on Green New Deals and market-driven growth fail to deal with systemic market failure on climate risks and resource depletion, so also enhanced social expenditure will also fail if state leadership does not provide a path out of the climate and ecological crisis via emergency policies. Degrowth is necessary in the absence of absolute decoupling, but the degrowth movement has yet to produce even a basic strategy on how its objectives can be translated into institutional structures at state or global level. This situation is unprecedented. Emergency level action will become inevitable given the lack of action to date, but will it be democratic? Reducing the hyperconsumption of the world's most affluent sector seems like an unimaginable political obstacle. People do not take lightly to deep change, even when it is necessary to protect the things they care about. My colleague in Melbourne, Boris Frankel, the sociologist, asks whether preventing ecological and civilizational collapse is more important than democracy. He's just published a book on it called Sustainability versus Democracy. This is particularly a question, especially as the conflicted state is wedged between the need to transition to a sustainable economy operating within safe planetary boundaries and business and community opposition to the actions that are required. Clearly, public education and mass public mobilisation are a key to pressuring state institutions. Movements such as Extinction Rebellion, however, will fail if proposed citizens' assemblies become mere talking shops devoid of any clear and urgent proposals to the state. Lastly, business so far has failed to take the challenge seriously enough. Neoliberalism has served business well, and strong state intervention is an anathema. But capitalist dynamics are incapable of responding appropriately given the failures of markets to deal with the high-end risks. Change would require in business long-term interests and the common good being placed above short-term interests that presently dominate the market, and there are few signs of that happening. Most of the global capitalist elite, by their actions, indicate that they think they can survive well enough despite disabling climate impacts. And I referred here to the work of Bruno Latour, who says that most of the ruling class recognises that in a hotter world, there will not be enough Earth for everyone, hence they have given up on a common purpose for humanity. He says artificial and automation in their world will replace the shrinking global population with elaborate plans for self-protection, such as escape to New Zealand, hideaway as Plan B, or heading for Mars as Plan C, led by Musk, Branson and Bezos. Latour says that three critical features of our times are climate denial and delay, deregulation and growing inequality. These features have helped create a super rich caste who are determined that a sort of gilded fortress, in Latour's terms, must be built for that small percentage who would be able to make it through in a hotter world. Now that fortress, that gilded fortress, is pure fantasy. First, it grossly underestimates the physical impacts of climate change, the aridification, the unlivable heat, the sea level rises, and so on. Techno-optimism has blinded elites to this problem. Secondly, it underestimates the social consequences. At just 3 degrees of warming, for example, perhaps 1 billion people will be displaced globally and coastal cities inundated, contributing to political mayhem and what US security analysts describe as likely outright global chaos. Thirdly, in such circumstances, the global market and financial systems, which are already fragile and destabilised, will collapse. And with it, the illusion of a gilded fortress will crumble. Finally, if this scenario is to change, the ruling elites, more or less as they exist now, must be part of the transformation, given the imperatives for dramatic action on a short, decadal 1 to 2 decade time frame. What, if anything, could bring them to their senses? How can the vehement opposition to state leadership on sustainability and a common future purpose for humanity be broken? Can a sustained mobilisation of people who cherish this earth and yearn for a future for humanity overcome this resistance? On these questions hang the future of human civilization. And thanks very much.